Thank you for being here. It's an amazing turnout, and it's so great to see all of you here. And by now, I mean, at least I speak for myself, we're becoming adjusted to this new way of being together, but we remain committed and can't wait to when we'll be together again in the CESTA space and offer lunch and anything and smiles and in person. But I'll start, I see that people are still joining in, but I want to start introducing our speaker today so we have enough time also for questions afterwards. So it's a great pleasure and a privilege to introduce someone many of you know very well, but it's the first time that we have speaking to us at CESTA. So the speaker today is Ben Albritton, who is the rare book curator for special collections at the Stanford Library, which means that he's in charge of the more than 265,000 titles, both antiquarian and modern, in that incredible collection that we have here at Stanford. And that means so much to the research and teaching of so many of us. And I must say, I speak for myself, Ben has had this role for 1 year now, and the visits that I've had for my own work and with my classes this year have been a tremendous joy and incredible learning experiences. So thank you for that. It's not a surprise that it could be so enriching, given the tremendous experience of research and work that Ben brings to this role. He originally is a PhD, I discovered, was in music history, but it's at the intersections of words and music in the 14th century that Ben already started thinking at that time about the most innovative digital approaches that one could develop. And it has been incredible how much of a pioneer and a leader in this field of digital humanities and manuscript he has become, contributing to various projects and spearheading initiatives as well in this field. And I just name a few important ones here at Stanford, such as the Parker Library, that is one of the first large digital initiatives undertaken by the library in collaborations with another entity. And just now there is a new collaborations with the Vaticana collection, which is tremendous as well. And he's also been a crucial collaborator for the text technology project and lab spearheaded by Elaine, headed by Elaine Therein here at Stanford, and also in that incredible effort that is the F digitizing initiative. Ben has been a crucial participant in that too. So I think we're very, very lucky, and we learn a lot today as Ben talks to us about what the manuscript fragments in the Stanford collections are and how the afterlife can be a digital one as well for our digital age. So with no further ado, please let me welcome Ben and leave the word to him, and we'll have time for questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanna. Let me go ahead and get my screen set up here. Let's see. Share this. Start the slideshow. Okay, how's that looking to everybody? Okay, great. Thank you, Giovanna, for that very kind and very warm introduction. And thank you to Dylan Gish, Amanda Wilson Bergato, and Giovanna Cesarani for hosting this wonderful series at the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. These lunchtime seminars have really taught me so much while we've been working away from campus. And I hope that they continue on and on into the future. Thanks very much to that team. Thanks also to Lisa Fagan Davis for her Fragmentology webinar a few weeks back. This is available on YouTube for anybody who wants to see it, for encouraging us all to think a little bit more about the role fragments have played, both in the development of our institutional collections, but also in our patterns of use of these materials. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, is both how our fragment collection developed here at Stanford, which will probably be a very familiar story to many other institutions as well. And then a little bit about what we're trying to do to make those fragments easier to access for scholars digitally, and particularly about how this interaction with fragments and other institutions has really tied us to colleagues all around the world, to make us think a little bit differently about the way that we collect and about how we express our desire for collaboration across institutions. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the development of the Stanford manuscript collections and the fragments therein. And it's a little bit of a hazy picture. So as an overview, we've focused a lot over the last century on developing teaching collections around specific topics within book history. We began acquiring in the early 20th century and have continued acquiring fragments till very recently. And so we've got these wonderful little pockets of material that have accumulated over time, often not being very deeply studied, occasionally showing up in multiple classes. And over time, various curators and library staff have tried to organize these into different kinds of sets to make them easier to discover or easier to work with in teaching and research. So we'll take a little look about how this all happened, starting with our very earliest acquisitions. And this is where it really does get a little bit hazy, because we haven't delved into the manuscript collection records quite as deeply as I would like. And this is something that we'll try to be pulling out more over the next year, is how those early materials first came into the library. But we know that in the 1927 Pages from the Past catalog from the Foliophiles, Inc., Stanford Libraries was listed as a customer. We don't know what we bought from them quite yet, but we know that they at least were telling other people that we were buying from them. We also likely acquired some early materials through foundational library purchases, like the Hildebrand Library, which was an intact library purchased from Europe, which brought in some of our incunables, certainly some manuscript fragments, and a large number of rare books. Overall, though, I think what we'll see over the next few minutes is how much our collection was shaped by and reflective of the 20th century manuscript trade when Stanford was doing the bulk of its collecting, really a reflection of what was happening in North America with manuscripts at the time. I'm going to look at three of our earliest acquisitions that I can precisely pinpoint to start off with, just to give you a sense of what our work in the 30s looked like. And this is made immeasurably easier by our miscellaneous acquisitions records, which you can see an opening page here from those from 1933. A little bit of a close-up on that. The first acquisition that I could find that was medieval and fragmentary was acquired on January 17th, 1934 from a longtime Stanford donor, Albert Bender. We have a Bender room in Green Library named after Bender. And that entry, which you can see on the left, described a large initial with diapered grounds containing a drawing of a man holding bells, possibly 16th century, from a psalter and mounted on boards. This was likely all the information that we got when we acquired this item. And we still actually can tie that record back to our online catalog, and now a digital record for this illuminated initial for you to explore a little bit further. So it's nice to be able to put together that 1934 entry with an item that we've still got in our collection. The manuscript, the catalog record includes the information about acquisition and its former miscellaneous number alongside its current shelf mark. So we can at least tie those two together, current and past. And just a quick aside, the person who made all of this possible by her incredible cataloging and record keeping was a former Stanford librarian named Jeanette Hitchcock. Just want to bring her up here because she's fundamental to what happened in the Stanford collections through the 30s and 50s. She graduated from Stanford in 1914, got a library degree at the University of Washington in 1918, came to Stanford as a cataloger in 1923, became keeper of rare books in 1936, and then moved up to become the chief of the Division of Special Collections from 47 to 55. So for a good 2.5 decades, she really helped build what we have here at Stanford. And in this picture, she's looking at a copy of the Nuremberg Chronicle held in our reading room now. So her records here are what we're looking at, and I found the first purchase that I could identify as well, which is this rather unusual Chaucer portrait from about 1400, purchased from the dealer Gottschalk for $450. And that winds up being about $9,000 in today's money. So it gives you a sense of what Stanford Libraries was willing to do in the 30s to acquire something like this when they didn't have a whole lot of material like this. This was likely driven by faculty needs at the time for teaching and interest. And this particular portrait has been researched multiple times over the decades with no clear conclusions yet, but there's a study being done right now on Chaucer portraits, which hopefully will turn up a little bit more information about what this thing is that we're looking at. Also available online. And I should mention that through CESTA, I will share these slides so that all of the links that I have on the slides are available to people who might be interested in tracking this stuff down further. So our first two recordable acquisitions are a donation and a purchase. And then our third is a leaf in 1935 that we acquired from a professor at Stanford. And many of our fragmentary and even rare book materials have come into the collection through faculty associations and student associations. And this is one of those. A leaf from a Spanish antiphonal executed in or near Granada shortly after the downfall, ... on and on. So this was listed as MISC 410 in 1935. And with the move to online record keeping, it disappeared from our catalogs. And it disappeared until January of 2019, when two of my colleagues, Polly Armstrong and Peter Whidden, found a tightly rolled manuscript leaf sitting in one of the map drawers. And that came along with a letter. And so matches very closely the description here, where there is a descriptive letter to A.B. Clark mentioned in the Miscellaneous acquisition record. A little aside about the letter. This is a letter from Philip Duchesne, book dealer in the middle of the 20th century. And he's recommending that Professor Clark stop off and see a fellow named Otto Ege in Ohio on his way back to California. So bringing together a little bit of the rare book trade in the middle of the 20th century in a single letter. And it was nice to be able to recover this particular item and add it back into our catalog record and collections to start making it available again. Duchesne continued to sell leaves from this right into the 1940s. I particularly love this catalog with printed books, medieval manuscripts, and holiday gifts. A lot of fun. And here is the record for the leaves, of which this one is a part. And I want to particularly call out the fact that this particular catalog record winds up being picked up in catalogs as other people have bought these leaves over time. So we have partner leaves at the Phoenix Public Library in Arizona, at the Reading Public Museum in Pennsylvania. And this is a good moment to stop and just say that while we don't condone breaking of books, these fragments have brought together collections that are very diverse across North America and Europe and the world, really. And every time we find one of these connections, it sort of ties us to these other institutions. It's an opportunity to reach out and talk to other curators, to bring scholars together around dispersed manuscripts in geographically different locations. And digitally, particularly, it's helped us to build communities around these dispersed books for reconstruction, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. So as we move into the 60s, 70s, and 80s in our collection profile at Stanford, we see a lot more purchases of specific sets put together by dealers for the purpose of teaching. And we were buying these to support codicological and paleographical teaching here at Stanford over time. Just calling out a few of the collections here. We buy calligraphy examples, we bought diplomatic manuscript documents, all in service of teaching here. And these are used heavily even today as sets for faculty here. Of course, I mentioned Otto Ege earlier. For those of you who haven't come across him, he's definitely worth a Google. But he was a dealer in Ohio, and his broken books have wound up all over North America, sold as sets, sold individually. Through our collecting in the 70s and 80s, though, we wound up purchasing single and multiple leaves from broken Ege books that had wound up circulating on the market freely outside of their initial leaf sets. So in the top right, you see a Petrus Riga leaf, which Lisa Fagan-Davis talked about in her discussion. This circulated through a dealer as a single leaf. We purchased it, I think, in the 1980s. Much like in the lower picture here, you see 18 leaves from another broken Otto Ege book. These were waste that were never included in his leaf sets, and we managed to purchase it, I think, in the mid-1980s. Also wanted to point out that over the decades, we've received numerous single leaves, small sets of leaves, and those have been aggregated into a medieval fragment study collection, which has in some ways erased their provenance. So there's always work to be done to go back and try to figure out where the leaves in our collection came from. And it's quite a challenge. Other leaves have come into our collections through leaf books. And I wanted to highlight here a set of Grabhorn leaf books. Grabhorn was a publisher in California in the 20th century. And there were 3 leaf books produced by Herbert Schultz, who at the time was a curator at the Huntington Library down in Pasadena. And his 3 publications include text related to the manuscript somehow, and then usually a single leaf tipped in. And these leaf books are in collections up and down the West Coast fairly heavily, but then across North America in general. So if you happen to have a Grabhorn leaf book by Herbert Schultz in your collection, let us know. We'd love to go ahead and reconstruct some of these as well. And through the 70s and 80s, we continue to get single leaves coming into the collection through private collectors, usually as part of a larger donation. So the Julian Wright art and photograph collection was one that particularly came to mind because we acquired it in the 1970s. And as you can tell from the description, the Julian Wright art and photograph collection circa 1300 to 1950, well, that raised a few question marks. So diving in, we were able to take a look and explore further what those materials were from the 1300s that came in. And you can see here, one of the items is a Foliophiles leaf pasted onto a piece of cardboard that had been sitting in a collection box. It's now being cataloged and conserved properly. And many thanks to the manuscript processing team in Special Collections for taking care of things like this as they come up and helping us preserve them for future use. Finally, we've got books within books, and this is an area that we're starting to explore here at Stanford with faculty and student help. We have hundreds and hundreds of manuscript fragments, uncatalogued, sitting in the bindings of our rare books and manuscripts collection. Professor Rowan Doran has started to work with some of his students to describe these, but this is a project that's going to take generations of faculty and students to really do in its entirety. So this is another way that fragments have come into our collection, and another way that we're encouraging their use and reuse through digitization. But to conclude, in terms of our adding fragments to our collection, we have invested pretty heavily in something that we call, others call as well, digital philanthropy. And I wanted to call out particularly the Robert T. and Catherine States Burke collection here, because it's a visual set of delights for one thing, but it's also a wonderful example of the ability to use digitization to bring even collections in private hands to the world. Bob and Kathy Burke have put their collection on deposit at Stanford libraries, but they allowed us to digitize and make these materials available to the world online. And this is probably the first time that all of these fragments have been back together since they were initially broken up in the 18th and 19th century as part of a large collecting frenzy that saw a number of Italian books dismembered and put on the collecting market, primarily for English and European buyers at the time. But these have continued to circulate through the book trade. And Bob and Kathy have been able to bring these back together, 41 fragments in all, in just a stunning and sumptuous feast of manuscript fragments that are rewarding study by being online. The link is at the top of the slide here, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is we think about how our collection developed, which is obviously fragment heavy because of the way that the book trade was working in North America while we were doing a lot of collecting at Stanford. Manuscript fragments are also much easier to digitize than codices. So they wind up being addressed perhaps before we address codices because they're frequently flat, easy to photograph front and back and be done. So our digital collections represent fragments perhaps in an outsized way compared to our codices. That's just an interesting thing to think about. We're focusing now on trying to digitize more of our materials to give a broader perspective of what's in the collection. But at the moment, when you look at our online presence, there are hundreds of fragments compared to a handful of codices available. I wanted to take a moment to pause, though, and talk about the hidden labor of getting these materials online. So having the fragments in the collection is one thing, digitizing them is a separate thing, making them viewable and discoverable is an even further step. So just a quick shout out to some very visible faces on our team, Astrid Smith and Wayne Vanderkool, who've done a lot of the photography for our rare materials and special collections here. And then Ann Myers and Laura Wilsey, who have really worked hard to catalog the materials and make them available on catalogs and discovery and environments as well. And then there are literally dozens of people on the digital and special collections side who have made this material available more freely. So let's pivot now to talk about supporting the digital lives or afterlives of these materials. As you could tell from the description of how our collection developed, it's very, very varied. We are linked to institutions everywhere. And we wanted to make sure that we could reuse and interoperate with the various materials. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the International Image Interoperability Framework and one of the platforms for accessing material through the IIIF, which is Mirador. I'm not going to do a deep dive on that here, both for time reasons, but also because there are resources for this available online elsewhere. But the primary thing that I want to talk about is how when we're dealing with materials split between different institutions, we want to make them portable so that scholars can use them outside of a current environment. We're looking at two manuscript fragments from Dante, one at Stanford and one at Harvard, both available via IIIF. And we're going to pull them into an external environment called Mirador for viewing and comparison. And so what we're doing is we're using an underlying protocol to allow us to pull in images, one held at Stanford, one held at Harvard, into an external viewing environment and then manipulate them as if we had them available to us. This is the most common use case that we've got for fragments, is just comparing across institutions to see if something might be related. Mirador allows us an extra step, which is to annotate some of those and share our annotations further. So for these two, I might be doing an analysis of whether the capital E's between the two fragments are similar. So in a nutshell, encouraging reuse by making it easier to make these materials portable. You don't have to go to Stanford, you don't have to go to Harvard to work with the materials, but can bring them into your own scholarly environment, whatever that might be. Other ways that we're trying to encourage digital afterlives is through class research here at Stanford. And I'd like to call out particularly a project that Professor Rowan Doran in history has been doing. I mentioned it earlier, of cataloging fragments held in the bindings of our books. So here you see an online catalog record of a report that Rowan and his students produced, describing a handful, about 50 of our printed books with manuscript fragments in them. It was a wonderful way for us to get feedback back about what we have in our collection. And it's now a standalone object in its own right in the Stanford Digital Repository. But it's also allowed Ann Myers and her cataloging team to enhance our catalog records and make those binding wastes more discoverable. So she added a genre field here that you can now use to bring together binding waste across our collections. So a nice virtuous circle there of making materials available to scholars doing research with them, giving it back to the library using that to enhance their records. So in the final section of my talk here, I'd like to kind of reassess where we are now, what we can do with what we've got in terms of fragments and digitization, and then look forward a bit and invite you to think more about what we could do together. So the simplest use case, of course, and probably the fundamentally most useful one, is bringing all of these things together in a single online environment so that people can find them and then take them elsewhere for reuse. At Stanford, we use an online exhibit platform called Spotlight, overseen by Catherine Astor in the Digital Library Systems and Services Group, and our online catalog SearchWorks, which is also run by DLSS. With these two tools, we try to provide, well, a single place where all of the materials can be browsed easily, and then point out to deeper catalog records beyond that. As I mentioned earlier, our online presence right now skews heavily towards fragments, mostly as an artifact of the ease of early fragment digitization compared to codices. But you can browse all of these. We've got about 411 medieval and ancient items online, and some early modern as well. And we'll start working on building out different exhibits with these at exhibits.stanford.edu MSS. All of those materials are available by IIIF, and you'll see a IIIF logo when you see an item in there, which can be dragged out into other environments. And that allows us to do some things like reconstruction. So I mentioned that we bought 18 Ege leaves in the 1980s. We can use IIIF to annotate those with transcriptions, but we can also use IIIF to start bringing those back together in object reconstructions. And what we've just done in the video here is moved between Stanford and South Carolina live as if it was a single object, even though the images are coming from different repositories. Lisa Fagan-Davis talked about these kinds of reconstructions a little bit last week, and I'm going to point to one of her projects in just a moment. But this is the sort of project that could easily be done by a student here at Stanford or elsewhere, or by interested research groups if you happen to find a book that is dispersed across places. And we're always happy to help consult on those kinds of reconstructions in the library. Another way of looking at this is using IIIF to compare items across very far-flung repositories. So in the 19th century, a number of illuminated initials were cut out of a Sistine Chapel choir book and then sold on the market, of course. One of those has found its way into a private collection here in the Bay Area. And through digital philanthropy, we were able to acquire the digital image for that. And with our partners at the Vatican, we were able to encourage digitization of the full manuscript from which it came. So now we can start to put together a manuscript fragment held in California with the book in the Vatican Library where it was held, and compare artistic elements, try to replace where this particular fragment came from within the book, and start to work on reconstructing a digital version of the whole. Unfortunately, the leaf from which that fragment came seems to have disappeared over time. It's no longer integral with the fragment itself that was cut out, and is no longer part of the Sistine Chapel book. So perhaps we'll have an opportunity to find that somewhere else in another collection. As I mentioned, though, there are tools to make this easy to do for researchers and scholars anywhere. And one particularly good one is fragmentarium.ms, produced in Switzerland by a group that also includes the leaders of the e-codices digitization project. This tool allows you to bring together via IIIF leaves from multiple institutions and build a digital reconstruction in their environment, also available by IIIF. And I'm just pointing here to Lisa Fagan-Davis's Beauvais Missile reconstruction. But she and others have done something similar with classes. And it's a wonderful opportunity for undergraduates or library students to search for these fragments across multiple institutions and then reconstruct them as a way of both understanding how online searching works and catalog searching works across institutions, but also give something back to the community by bringing these leaves back together in a single place for reuse. Where we are now in terms of transcription is also IIIF supported. And I'm calling out here again another project here at Stanford, Latin Paleography Workshop, Paleography Slam, run by Rowan Doran on a periodic basis. And they're using IIIF to put our fragments into a transcription platform called From the Page, which allows crowdsourcing, club sourcing, and class sourcing transcription. On the left-hand side, you'll see a list of fragments that they've been working on as a group. It's a fairly small group of students, faculty members, and interested parties getting together to transcribe. And then their results wind up as transcriptions attached to those images. Because this is IIIF, we can pull those transcriptions back in, make them part of the digital object as well, and allow us to search within our fragment collection at a full text level. So again, that virtuous circle of pushing material out, letting scholars do interesting things with them on a stable protocol, and bringing that back together. And that material can be output in a number of different ways, from HTML to build a simple web page of your transcription, to plain text, to TEI XML, and to IIIF annotations. So a number of opportunities for reuse. If there's anybody in CESTA or in the audience today who wants to do a transcription project with the Stanford digitized item, we're happy to set that project up for you and work with you to complete it. IIIF, though, is allowing us to think ahead a little bit about ways we could tell stories with the annotations that are created on the digital object. And I'm showing here an item from a Burke miniature from the Burke collection, where we've gone through and created IIIF annotations that focus on specific regions of an image and allow us to work our way through a very singular item and bring out different kinds of details. So it's the sort of thing that you might use in teaching or in presentation to describe what's happening within an item using IIIF and in this case, Mirador, and a product called Stories by a British company called CogApp. So this is just data that's being reused. The image is hosted at Stanford. The annotations are hosted at Stanford, but they're being brought together in an external environment for reuse. So the data becomes fragmented in much the same way that the manuscripts are fragmented themselves to allow us to tell these stories. So coming up on time in terms of closing out the presentation part of this, and we'll move into questions in just a moment, but I wanted to just close with a few comments. I talked a little bit about how our collection was shaped by the purchase of fragmentary material. It was done for that reason because of the way the book market worked throughout the 20th century. It was done that way because we didn't have the money to purchase codices for a lot of our library's history. And it was done that way because of teaching and research interests, which were looking for variety rather than singular codexes at the time. Those trends change, but of course our collections right now are shaped by how we purchased in the past, and our digital activities have been shaped by trying to respond to what we hold. So these are tied together in very intimate ways. It's given us an opportunity to leverage our digital library work to explore these fragments in different ways. But more importantly, it's really helped us in the library and at Stanford to make connections across the world. As Lisa Fagan-Davis was pointing out in her fragmentology talk, a single scholar now using IIIF can bring together multiple institutions. And what we're finding is that that allows conversations across repositories to talk about what might be a prioritization for digitization, how we might work together to share information, how we can even harmonize our catalog records to make these all more discoverable for scholars and researchers in the future. And that can be shown visually as my final two slides by returning to that Otto Ege manuscript #1, a single holding in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1940s became a far-flung, at least 35 institutions that we know of so far, collection across the world that now connects multiple special collections libraries. So that's just a little bit of what we're doing with fragments and digitization here. And I'm going to end with that, but look forward to hearing if you have questions and taking the discussion further. Oh, one last thing. If you happen to have private collections of manuscripts and you want to share them this way, we are very interested in expanding our digital philanthropy program. So get in touch with me and we can talk about how we could get digital images of your holdings out and available to scholars. Thanks.
All right, Ben has very kindly agreed to take questions from us. We're going to follow our usual protocol for registering an interest and asking these questions rather. If you'd scroll to the bottom of your screen and click on the participants icon and open that participants window, at the bottom of that little column that pops up, there'll be a hand icon, so you can digitally raise your hand. Please use this to let me know that you're interested, and then I will manually sort you and unmute you. So we're open for questions now. All right, Richard, I see your hand. I'm unmuting you now. Go ahead.
Hey, Ben, thanks a lot. That was really great. I was wondering if you could say more about the books within books and like what's the provenance of those? How did those come about, and how is that like a really large phenomenon? And a little more about that.
Sure, thanks, Rich. And it's really good to see you. So the books within books, right back into medieval times, fragments were being reused in bindings to wrap materials, to strengthen bindings, and that practice continues sometimes at increased paces over time into the 20th century. So we've got about 500 years of printed materials that also include manuscript fragments in them. And this was such an unremarkable occurrence that many times they are not cataloged at all. So a rough estimate is that we've probably got thousands of these sitting within our collection, untouched, undiscovered, and they only come to light when somebody happens to order up the book that has them in them, and then further expresses an interest in that, and beyond that brings it to somebody's attention that it's there. So it's a fairly common occurrence to find these fragments in bindings. It's a very new and challenging area for us to try to get a handle on bringing those together for study and research.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, Kelly, I see your hand. Oh, no, you've disappeared. All right, Lisa, I see your hand. I'm unmuting you now. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Thank you. Hey, hi, Ben. How are you? Thank you so much. This was really fantastic. It's such a great way to be introduced to these amazing collections that you all have. I was really intrigued by the notebook you showed with the early acquisition records from the early 20th century. Is that something that will be, or that could be digitized and made available? It looks like there's a lot of really useful provenance information in there that may be really interesting for studying the history of the book trade in the 20th century.
Thanks, Lisa, and thank you also for all the work you've done in this space. It's definitely what got me thinking about how to think about our collections from a fragment point of view. Jeanette Hitchcock's Miscellaneous Acquisitions Notebook is one of my favorite things to have come across since I started the job about a year ago. And at the moment, it is not cataloged, it is not digitized, and it was sitting in a banker's box among our collection files. So one of the things that I and my colleague Glenn Edwards and her team would like to do is get this properly cataloged and available to researchers, because yes, it's an absolute wealth of material. It lists who the donors were, it lists which dealers we bought materials from, it lists if things had been deacquisitioned. It's just a wonderful wealth from about 1933 into the war years of what was happening in Stanford libraries.
Oh, that's so cool.
Thanks for asking, and it's a great impetus to get that digitization done and shared.
Thanks.
All right, Kelly, I see your hand again. I'm unmuting you now. Go ahead, Kelly.
Hi, thank you very much. I would like to know more about the transcription program, who that is targeted to and who all can participate, and what the criteria is.
Okay, great.
Please.
Thank you for the question, Kelly. So From the Page is one of several crowdsourcing platforms that are available. The Smithsonian and Library of Congress have some as well, and Zooniverse does something similar. From the Page is run by Sarah and Ben Brumfield in Austin, and they work with cultural heritage institutions around the world to set up these kinds of projects. You can go to fromthepage.com, see the platform, sign up, and play around with it. It's a very, very flexible platform. So you can upload images to it for transcription if you're doing genealogy, or if you have small collections in libraries. And the Brumfields are more than happy to work with you in terms of getting projects set up. They're extremely responsive as a team. We use it in Stanford primarily with materials that we've already digitized. So if you're interested in something in the Stanford collections that has been digitized, we can set up a project within minutes and then make you a co-owner or a team member on it. And we've done that with a number of occasions right now. If you look for Stanford, when you go to From the Page, you'll see all of the transcription projects that we're working on at the moment. We use IIIF to send our images to them and pull the data back. That's not necessarily a requirement everywhere, but it is what we like to do at Stanford, because we like to put together the data that we retrieve back with the digital object and be able to tie in the list of people who are doing the transcriptions to that, so that we've got credit for the people who are doing the work of transcription alongside the digital object. It's free to use as a transcriber. If you want to host projects, I think there's a fee, but a lot of it depends on how you want to set up a project. And like I said, the Brumfields are fantastic to work with. So if you just discuss with them how you would like to get started.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, Elaine, I see you. I'm unmuting you now. Go ahead, Elaine.
Thanks, Dylan. Thanks, Ben. Absolutely wonderful presentation, very thought-provoking, and kind of making coherent what has previously been, I think, such an unknown set of materials or sets of materials. My question really is about value, and perhaps it can't be answered at the moment, but it seems to me that in relation to the early 20th century, or even in relation to the early 19th century, or at least during the development of photography, the fixation on fragments is it's a cyclical thing. And you know, so there's collectors who manage to acquire these materials. And then I was thinking about like Ruskin in the 19th century, those who sort of focused on fragments kind of come around in waves. And there seems to be such a movement at the moment because of digitization, because of the tools that digitization has brought to the fore to allow us to bring these materials together. And kind of since so many collections have fragments, that there's this democratizing impulse that we saw with ironically with Ege and so on. So my question really is one that demands your kind of prognostication powers to think about, away from that moment where someone is going to discover a brand new text that nobody knew anything about, which I suspect is the driving impetus of a great deal of research that's going on in fragmentology. And I think that that's obviously absolutely fine. But the majority of us are never going to make that huge discovery. We're going to find another version of a Maximus Confessor sermon, or another bit of Priscian's grammar, texts that were already kind of very widely known. And we can find variants, as you did in the class that you taught, indeed. We can find variants from some of these fragments. What in the end, aside from more transcription of more individual leaves, and actually the community aspect of it, which I thought was a really valuable thing to bring out, what is the value that you can see emerging from this current interest in fragments and fragmentology? And I know Lisa is there in the background too, and obviously that's kind of, you know, it's at the forefront of what she's doing in her scholarship. So yeah, that's my question. What is the value, do you think?
That's such a hard question, Elaine. There's so many different ways to answer that. I'm going to think about the value from a perspective that I had as a grad student when I was learning paleography, from photocopies of plates in paleography books. And I think you and I and Lisa shared this particular experience where we were frequently tasked with transcribing the same thing as our classmates, without seeing a wide range of variation in hands outside of the teaching examples. Now, those of us who studied in North America probably even more so than folks who had access to manuscript materials more readily elsewhere. So if you think, 10, 15 years ago, that's how we were learning paleography. And the fragment collections at the time in different institutions were extremely helpful because they gave us a broad range of hands, at least, to work from, live examples. And then flip that to what's happening now digitally. We have hundreds of leaves from the same manuscript showing up in different institutions, but available online for sort of targeted transcription practices. But more than that, we've got literally hundreds of thousands of fully digitized manuscripts all across Europe and North America, from similar hands showing lots of scribal variation that really sort of fundamentally could change the way that we teach students paleography. So instead of all of us doing example 2.1 from Brown, I don't know, everybody finds a 13th century hand that's similar from a different institution and works on it, or a leaf from the same manuscript to show scribal variation across a class of paleography students. So I think you're right that I'm wandering a little bit from the question, but to come back to it, I think you're right that there is a democratization that's happening. But I also think it's more than just a study of paleography that we're interested in here. As Lisa has shown, reconstructing these books is a first step to opening them up to further provenance research, to understanding the movements of manuscripts in Europe and North America during the 19th and 20th century, to understanding the values that were placed on different types of manuscripts in the 19th century. When you think of all of the choir books that have been dismembered to save the very nice decorated initial, that tells you a lot about what kinds of values the 19th century had about music manuscripts that may no longer have been in use or of value to an institution. The bits that were important were saved and are now on the market and available. And so we can kind of reconstruct the mindset of how manuscripts were perceived over the centuries by how they were broken up and resold. And bringing together all of our fragments allows us to ask bigger questions like that across time and geography. I don't know, that's where I'm at with it right now. Thanks, Elaine.
All right, Giovanna, I see your question or your hand. I'm going to unmute you now. Go ahead, Giovanna. Okay. Yes, there you are.
Thank you for this presentation, and it's really tremendously fascinating and interesting, and such a wonderful, I was lucky to hear Lisa a couple of weeks ago, and so an whole world is opening up for me, which is tremendous. And I want to ask a question that builds up about this idea of the democratizations, and it's so comforting, especially now that we are so isolated, to talk about something that opens the possibility of connections that go all that are global, and at least in the Americas and Europe. But I'm coming to this from the point of view more of the material that I usually look for being digitized in my own work, which is, let's say, like 18th century printed books. And there is a great uneveness between different national traditions that also ends up then influencing the kind of work that one does. And so for Italy, there is nothing like Echo, for example. And so for many other parts of the world. And so I am curious if, and this is from since I don't know your field of manuscripts and fragmentology as well, I don't understand if there is something within your field and the material that circulates in that you work with that makes it more even, or this problem of unevenness between different countries' tradition not as present, or that you got something in your field very right in terms of approaching and bringing together libraries from all over the world in a different way. Does this make sense as a question? Because it's a beautiful world of possibilities that instead I know that in someone like I end up working on certain topics also because I can find the material much more easily, while I know that I couldn't do the same thing for 18th century Italy because there is not something like Echo, for example.
Right. Oh, that's a wonderful question, Giovanna. Thank you for that. So is there something special about medieval studies that has allowed this to happen? I think it's just, this might be too shallow an answer, so please follow up with me if it's not. But medievalists began early with digitization, and we have full manuscript digitization projects happening in the late 80s and early 90s that slowly built over 3 decades into full library digitization projects, and now very broad digitization projects from the very large libraries. So, you know, you think about something like the Beowulf Manuscript, which was a focus project very early on. And it took almost 2 decades to get from there to Parker on the Web, which was just 500 and something manuscripts fully digitized. And then it took another 5 years to get us to 13,000 manuscripts from the BNF and approaching 20,000 manuscripts from the Vatican, with more coming from the British Library and Cambridge and Oxford all the time. as well as national projects like eCodices bringing thousands and thousands of manuscripts. So it was a long, slow process to get to an inflection point where scholars like Elaine Traharn or Lisa Fagan-Davis were helping to drive that. So their research interests were not just focused on what had been digitized, but always pushing the envelope and encouraging libraries to do more. And we saw that sort of across the board in medieval studies. I'm not an early modernist, but I'm seeing the same sort of impetus from early modernists where larger digitization projects are starting to drive different kinds of questions, different types of research interests. And it may just be that the medievalists got there a little bit earlier. I will say that the classicists probably beat us all to it. So it's sort of a subject area, faculty interest, research, teaching, and publication programs that feed back into the digitization process. So you may be working on something that's digitized, but you're asking questions that would force additional digitization, and it should be part of a cycle that drives us forward.
Excellent. Any more questions for Ben before we adjourn? All right, next week, Marie Saldana will be presenting on the Rio Grande settlers, the family history, 1577 to 1848. Same link, same time, please join us. And let's all sort of wave our hands frantically to thank Ben one last time. Thank you, thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, Giovanna. And thank you, Amanda. This was great. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.